So how does a brand new, fragile country become a confident world power? Well, today we're going to unpack that exact story, a messy, defining conflict that's often called America's second war for independence.
I mean, it sounds like the setup for a pretty wild movie, right? What in the world connects a burning White House, a bunch of pirates, and the US national anthem? The answer is a single, incredibly risky conflict that forged a nation's identity: the War of 1812. And to really get a sense of the stakes here, just look at this. The US Navy had like 16 ships total. The British Royal Navy, 600. This wasn't just a fight, it was a massive gamble. The young United States was essentially picking a fight with the world's greatest superpower.
So, how did this epic David versus Goliath showdown even happen? Well, it all started out on the open ocean, where things between the United States and Great Britain had been getting ugly for years.
Okay, so the first big problem was this. Britain was in this huge all-out war with Napoleon's France, and to choke the French economy, the British used their enormous navy to set up blockades. But these blockades didn't just stop French ships, they stopped American ships too, and it was crushing US trade. But the thing that really got under the skin of Americans was a practice called impressment. The word sounds kind of formal, but trust me, the reality was anything but. British warships would literally stop American ships, board them, and kidnap sailors, claiming they were British deserters and forcing them into the Royal Navy. It was a complete violation of American sovereignty. So you've got all these pressures building up, right? You've got the impressment of sailors, the trade blockades hurting the economy, and on top of that, the British were supporting Native American tribes who were resisting American expansion out west. Back in Washington, a group of young congressmen known as the War Hawks were just screaming for a fight. Finally, President James Madison gave in and asked Congress to declare war in June of 1812.
So the country wanted war, no doubt about it. But wanting a war and being ready for one are two very, very different things. And the United States was completely unprepared for the fight it had just picked.
And you can really see how chaotic it was just by looking at the timeline. It was this wild roller coaster of highs and lows. You have a huge American naval victory on Lake Erie, then, not even a year later, the absolute disaster of the British burning Washington, D.C. That's followed almost immediately by the legendary defense of Fort McHenry, and the whole thing ends with the incredible Battle of New Orleans, which, get this, was fought after the peace treaty was already signed.
Let's talk about that low point, because it was devastating. In August 1814, British troops marched right into the new capital city, Washington, D.C., and they set fire to the most important symbols of American government, the White House and the Capitol building. It was a national humiliation.
But out of that disaster, we get this incredible story of heroism. First Lady Dolly Madison absolutely refused to flee the White House, not until she knew that critical government papers and, most famously, that iconic portrait of George Washington were safely evacuated. She literally saved a piece of American history just hours before the British torched the place. After burning the Capitol, the British Army turned its sights on the next big prize, the major port city of Baltimore. And the key to taking Baltimore was a star-shaped fort guarding its harbor, a place called Fort McHenry. And what happened there would become the stuff of legend.
For more than 24 hours, the British fleet just relentlessly pounded Fort McHenry. An American lawyer, Francis Scott Key, was actually being held on one of the British ships, and he had to watch the whole thing. All night, he saw nothing but the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air. He had no idea if the fort had fallen. But then, at dawn's early light, he saw the American flag was still there, flying over the fort. He was so moved, he scribbled down a poem, which, of course, became the Star-Spangled Banner.
So look, on paper, this war didn't really have a clear winner, but that's not how it felt. For Americans, the final act of this conflict felt like a massive victory, and it completely changed the way they saw their country. It all came down to the Battle of New Orleans. The American forces were led by General Andrew Jackson, this tough-as-nails guy from the frontier. And his army, well, it was one of the strangest groups ever assembled. We're talking state militia, frontiersmen, free African Americans, and, I'm not making this up, actual pirates, led by the famous Jean Lafitte. And they were going up against a professional, well-trained British army. And the result? It was an absolute rout. The British had over 2,000 casualties. The Americans? A handful. It was a stunning, shocking, completely one-sided victory that nobody saw coming. But here is the most incredible part of the entire story. Because news traveled so slowly back then, nobody in New Orleans had any idea that the war was already over. A peace treaty had been signed in Europe 2 weeks earlier. The greatest American victory of the war was won after the war had officially ended. So, what was the final score? Well, the peace treaty itself, the Treaty of Ghent, mostly just reset everything to the way it was before the war. But that's not what mattered. The feeling in the country had changed. There was this huge surge of patriotism and national confidence. British harassment at sea was over. The US had proven it could go toe-to-toe with a global superpower and survive. It kicked off this whole new period of unity called the Era of Good Feelings. Riding this wave of newfound confidence, American leaders started to look inward. They wanted to make the country stronger from the inside out. And one of the biggest voices was a congressman from Kentucky named Henry Clay. Clay came up with this economic blueprint he called the American System. It had 3 main parts. First, create a new national bank to stabilize the currency and regulate business. Second, put in place protective tariffs, basically taxes on imported goods, to help America's new factories compete. And third, take the money from those tariffs and use it for internal improvements. Things like building new roads and canals to tie the huge, sprawling country together. Now, this new confidence wasn't just about building roads and banks. It also totally changed how America saw its role in the world, especially in its own backyard, the Western Hemisphere. See, around this time, a whole bunch of countries in Latin America were breaking away from Spain and declaring their independence. The US was watching this very closely, and they got worried that other European monarchies might try to step in and help Spain take back its old colonies. So in 1823, President James Monroe laid down the law. In a message to Congress, he issued a warning to Europe that was incredibly bold and direct. He said the US would consider any attempt by them to extend their system to this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. This statement became known as the Monroe Doctrine, and what it was really was a giant hands-off sign posted over the Americas. It declared that the Western Hemisphere was closed for business when it came to future colonization. It was a clear, powerful statement that the United States now saw itself as the lead power in its neighborhood. So when you think about it, the journey from a risky war against a superpower to a global declaration like that is just incredible. The War of 1812 truly was America's coming of age. The Monroe Doctrine told Europe to stay out of the Americas. So the final question is, how does that idea, that line in the sand, still shape global politics today?